Hi, Roger. It's Vivian. Hi, how are you? Hi, Roger. It's Vivian. Hi, how are you?
I'm not sure he's hearing you.
No, he's not. That's odd, but because you did. Hi. It's all right.
Yeah, no, I think that he might deliberately be designed to start at a certain time. So then when he puts it on YouTube, the audio recording starts with him and do the introduction saying, "Hi, I'm Roger Berkowitz," and all that stuff.
Oh, I see. Thanks for that.
That's
wow.
my theory anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right. That's amazing. Thank you.
Hey, Bill Jones, I see you got a plug in the New Yorker for the show next week. Good luck.
Really interesting.
It's not next week. It started 2 nights ago.
27. Yeah, I'm sorry. I got you.
Yeah.
I didn't mean it as a plug. I just wanted to mention it.
But it just goes to show you that although there is
All right, welcome everybody. We'll get going. Nice to see people here from all over. And I'll say that here in New York, it's getting warm and beautiful. So it's nice. I was glad to see Europe is going to open itself to Americans who are vaccinated. And I'll be in Europe for the first time in a year in 10 days. So I'm excited about that.
Oh, wow.
My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. We are reading The Human Condition. You know, for many people, this is Arendt's book that I hear from many people, it's their favorite book. It's certainly the book that maybe contains the mature Arendtian thought that informs all of her other thinking. I mean, I've made the argument and believe it to be the case that already in The Origins of Totalitarianism, almost every idea Arendt ever writes about later is already contained in that book. It's an extraordinary book. But this book is more thought out, more refined, and is the book where really, if you want to understand any of her other books or essays, finding where it is in this book is essential. And I say that as we begin chapter 6 of the book called The Vita Activa and the Modern Age, because in my understanding of Hannah Arendt, this is probably the most important chapter of all of her thought. And I'll go one step further, which I'm sure I'll regret, and say that these two first sections that we've read for today, section 35 on world alienation and section 36 on the discovery of the Archimedean point, maybe, and in fact, in my view, are the two most foundational chapters in all of Arendt's work for understanding her thought. They've been the most influential on me. In a weird way, I'll have to admit, and I'll say more about this later, but I had read Arendt in grad school, and I had read her in college, and I'd always liked her, but I was not an Arendt scholar by any means. And my first book, The Gift of Science, doesn't mention Arendt. And yet, when I came back to Arendt after I had come to Bard and reread this book and reread these two chapters, I realized that in many ways, these two chapters underlied the arguments of the book that I had made without thinking explicitly about her. And so they're very important in my own thinking and reading. So I will do the best I can to explain why, and hopefully you'll find these chapters as rich as I do. Okay. The first two chapters of the two first sections, I always do this, first two sections of chapter 6, sections 35 and 36, go together. They are together an exploration of what Arendt calls the three great events that stand at the threshold of the modern age and determine its character. So, I think it's fairly clear. The three events, she says, are the discovery of America and the ensuing exploration of the whole earth, the Protestant Reformation, which expropriated ecclesiastical and monastic possessions, and then, of course, expropriated the peasants from their land, which is a key move in her view, which led to the accumulation of wealth and the rise of capitalism. And the third event is the discovery of the telescope and the development of a new science, modern science, that considers the nature of the earth from the viewpoint of the universe. So these three events are for Arendt the great events that inaugurate our age, the modern age. They're not all equal, right? She says it very clearly that the most important of these events is the one that had the least impact right away, namely the discovery of the telescope. It's the most abstract of the three, but it, over the course of 300 years, has been the most impactful. All right, so we're gonna try and understand these three events and why they're so important. What is the overarching thesis of these two sections? It's pretty clear. It's alienation. Chapter 35 or section 35 is about what she calls world alienation. And section 36 is about what she's going to call earth alienation. Now, we can get all technical and understanding, and we will, and we'll try and make sure, I'll try and make sure you understand the difference, but it's not that important. The overarching importance of these two sections is her argument that the rise of the modern age, which often is called the age of secularization, the age of the loss of religion, the age of rationalism and the Enlightenment, the age of science. Thus, in its typical way, it's the age where we come down from transcendence to the world and we become worldly. I mean, I think when I was taught what secularization was in high school or something, you know, I was told it meant worldliness, right? Being in the world. For Arendt, it's exactly the opposite. Alienation and secularization mean worldlessness. Well, how is that possible? Well, what they mean, what her argument is that what all of these events do is divorce us and drive us away from the world, the common world, right? This idea that we've talked about in so many different ways over the course of the last few years, reading Arendt together. The worldlessness, the loss of truth, the loss of a common center, all of this is rooted in these two sections, 35 and 36, with Arendt's understanding of alienation, world and earth alienation. And so that's why these chapters are so important in any attempt to really understand Arendt's work throughout, her life. Okay. I know it's a bit of I know I made a strong claim. You guys can take me to task on it in the Q&A in a little bit. But let me try and now help us map ourselves through these three events. So the first event begins on page 250. She starts talking about it, and it's the discovery of the New World, America in this case, and but more importantly, the mapping and being able to put on a map and grid and sense of shrinking the world. The idea that once you map the world shrinks. And one of my favorite lines here is on page 250, where she says, "Only the wisdom of hindsight sees the obvious, that nothing can remain immense if it can be measured." That's I find that just one of Arendt's many wonderful phrases that says so much. The whole premise of the Age of Discovery was that we discovered new worlds and we made the world bigger. And yet the point is, if we make the world bigger, but we map it and we start saying, this is this distance and we can travel this distance, this fine, it becomes comprehensible, it becomes measurable. And once it becomes measurable, it loses its immensity, its grandiosity, and the world closes in. So that's one aspect of what she's interested in, this sort of shrinkage. But the real key part of what she's interested in with the Age of Discovery and the mapping of the world is that as she says on page 251, there's another aspect of this matter, right, of even greater importance in our context. And it's that it is the nature of the human surveying capacity, the capacity to survey and map, that it can function only if man disentangles himself from all involvement in and concern with the close at hand and withdraws himself to a distance from everything near him. And so this is what she's really after. In order to understand ourselves as I am Roger Berkowitz sitting in New York, but I'm in front of a computer talking to you on Zoom. The fact that I can imagine myself in 10 days in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, and that I know how long it's going to take me and how I'm going to get there, and I can follow my trip on an app. What this means is that I increasingly see myself as a citizen of the world and not as a citizen of the Upper West Side in New York or Annandale and Hudson and Bard. We increasingly lose our connection to the close at hand. We're so eager to think about solving the world's problems that we often don't realize we have to sit and be in the world's problems. So what does it mean to be in the now, to be in the present, to be in a space? And what she says is the greater distance between man and his surroundings, world or earth. So the greater the distance, right, the more he will likely be able to survey and to measure. So the further the distance, the more I can measure it, I can analyze it, I can understand it, the less will worldly earthbound space be left to him. And that's what she means by world alienation in the first instance. The decisive distance between man and the earth, the alienation of man from his immediate earthly surroundings. Okay, so that's the first event that she sees as contributing to the alienation of man from the world. The second is the Reformation. And there's two aspects, again, to the Reformation, just as there were two aspects to the mapping of the world. The first, and the one that's often more widely talked about, at least in my world of political theory, largely because of the success and the brilliance of Max Weber, is the Protestant ethic and the inner worldly asceticism of Protestantism. The idea that to prove your Christian faith and your goodness, you have to live an inner worldly life. And this inner worldly alienation, this, being good and being ascetic and not spending money, but showing that your inner life is a worthy life. She says, has nothing to do either in its content or intent with the alienation from the earth inherent in the discovery of taking possession of the earth, the first event. But what it does is it does move us inside of ourselves, internalize ourselves. And so what's important is not that we're rich or poor, but it's that we are good inside. And that internalization is a kind of alienation. The second, and for her in this case, more consequential aspect of the Reformation that leads to alienation is the expropriation of the peasantry, right? So the history here is that with the Reformation, first the Christian lands were expropriated and given to the secular authorities. And in giving those lands to the secular authorities, the peasants who had largely been serfs, people of the land, attached to the land, so that even though they were in some sense unfree, they also had their own land, which they would farm and thus had a certain place in the world. Well, with the expropriation of the church property and the breakdown of the feudal system, these serfs were then, in a sense, freed from their serfdom, their servitude. And yet in being freed from their serfdom, they had the land that they were living on and associated with ripped from them. And in having the land ripped from them, they became wage laborers. And in becoming wage laborers, they have lost their place in the world, right? And they become these abstract laborers who are basically without a meaningful place in the world. She talks about this a lot also, if you're interested, all the way back on page 66 in the chapter on the public and private, where she's talking about the move from from property to wealth, right? We talked about that a while ago, but in that section, the argument is that property is something that's in the English proper to yourself, proprietus. In the German Eigentum, it's what's most your own. And in property, you have your own things, your own place. When property is expropriated and turned into wealth, it becomes abstract and we lose a connection to the world. She uses an example here, which we can talk about later if you're interested, about creative destruction. The idea that in modern capitalist society, the best way to accumulate wealth is to have a disaster that wipes everything clean, an earthquake or a war. And what that allows is new property to be built anew, wealth to be amassed anew without the limits of conservation or conservatism. Because, if we have buildings that already exist, they're often inefficient. They're built for other things. And so we have to figure out how to remodel them or whatever. If you tear everything down, we can make it just, we can rebuild it quickly and efficiently in ways that are really, valuable for the economy. And so in a kind of Schumpeter-like twist, she says that creative destruction is evidence of the way in which expropriation leads to capitalism. And she also analogizes it to the waste economy. The whole premise of the waste economy is that everything we create is temporary and is to be consumed and, be out of date in a few years. This, she says, is necessary in a purely capitalist, expropriating, alienating society, because anything that lasts too long resists the need to constantly be recreated in a more efficient, abstract, non-alienated way. And so expropriation leads to world alienation. On pages 253 to 254, she makes this very surprising discussion about secularization that I mentioned earlier, whereas what secularization means is not worldliness, but actually world alienation. And she says that what Marx, on page 254, this footnote on Marx is quite interesting if we want to discuss it later. What Marx really was talking about was not self-alienation, as he writes about in Capital and other places, but world alienation. That the things are denatured. When we use a shoe for trade, we're not using it as it was meant to be, and we are abstracting it out. And so what Marx is really talking about is alienation in the sense of alienation from the world. Yeah, the end of this section on 256 to 257 is a very suggestive passage, not so important to the text, but I just want to mention what's going on. She argues that there's, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 stages of this alienation, which we will go through, right? One is that man is deprived of a family and his place in the world. He's expropriated and he's left alone, and man is thus becomes an individual. The second is that man leaves being an individual, but doesn't ever go back to being a family. Families are sort of accidental and not seen as essential to the modern world. And instead he becomes a member of a class or a society. The third, or 2B, as I understand it, the second part of that is that instead of being a class, he becomes a matter of a nation and of a nationalism, blood and soil. And the third, on page 257, is that with the decline of nation states and with the loss of classes, both of which she describes in book 3 of The Origins of Totalitarianism, what we see is that mankind now begins to become a universal or a cosmopolitan entity, one without national, class, or any local characteristics, and that this is the most radical form of world alienation. And as she says in the last sentence of this, it can lead to the rise of modern ideological mass movements, of the lonely mass man, and totalitarianism. So that's section 35 about world alienation. She now turns in section 36 to the third event, which she says stands at the threshold of the modern age, which I guess she gives a couple of names for. One is the discovery of the telescope by Galileo. One is the rise of modern science, and another is the discovery of the Archimedean point. These all, in a sense, say the same thing for her. What she says is there's an idea behind it, and then there's the event. And the ideas are important, but the event is what really allows things to coalesce. And this is true for all of her writing. Events are what drives our human history. So what is the event? The event is the discovery of the telescope. What does the telescope do? On page 259 to 260, she says at the bottom of 259, what Galileo did and what nobody had done before was to use the telescope in such a way that the secrets of the universe were delivered to human cognition with the certainty of sense perception. The secrets of the universe, right, were delivered to human cognition with the certainty of sense perception. What's so big about that? Why is that so important? Well, let's remember what Galileo did. The two great texts that Galileo writes about the telescope when he first invents it and starts to use it, or co-invents it, however you want to think about that. One is about his observation of the moons of Saturn, and the other is about his observation of mountains on the moon, our moon. And I'll just use the second one because it's the one that I think is simpler. What he does is he looks at the moon. And if we all look at the moon, we see there are dark spots and light spots. And he says, okay, well, with a telescope, I can see more dark spots and light spots. So what? Well, he says, why is there dark spots and light spots? And he then realizes that, well, the dark spots must be shadows. And they must be shadows because there must be mountains. And he says, well, if I look at the angle of the sun hitting the moon, I should be able to calculate how high those mountains are that create those shadows. And where you see light, you see the sun hitting the mountains, and you see shadows, it's behind it. And he calculates it. And the truth is, he was right. I mean, 200 years later, you know, modern technical analysis measured the mountains, and Galileo got it very close. It's an amazing insight, right? And so what he says is we can use the telescope to see the moon, and we can see there's mountains on the moon. But he didn't see the mountains. He didn't see mountains. He saw darkness and shadow. He just saw the darkness and shadow pretty clearly. And so what Arendt says is that what Galileo really taught us was not that with the telescope, we prove that sense perception is right. What he really taught us is that with the telescope, what we prove is that sense perception is unreliable, and that the only real reliable way to know anything is through mathematics. What he says is that with Galileo, two great ideas emerged. With the discovery of the telescope, two great ideas emerged. One is the sense of triumph, that we can figure out and know everything. We can learn about the moon, we can learn about the moons of the space, we can learn about black holes, we can learn about our cell structure, we can create new human beings, we can probably build new planets. This sense of triumph is extraordinary. And at the same time, it brings about a sense of incredible despair, that our senses betray us, that actually what we see is not what's true, that what's true is a mathematical, rational ideal that is never going to be adequately represented by our senses. And so there's at the one hand this triumph, and on the other hand, this despair. And what we do, Arendt says, is amidst this challenge to the adequacy of the senses to reveal reality, which he writes about on page 261, we begin to try and master and know reality, not through our senses, but through experiments and through tools, you know, like a telescope. We begin to not trust our senses to understand the world, but demand that we use tools and apparatuses and experiments to make the world reveal its hidden truth to us. And in doing that, we have to set up those experiments. We have to build those instruments. And so increasingly what we see in the world is not the world, but a world that we have made visible through our construction of experiments and tools, which already contain our biases and prejudices in them. So that the world we make visible is one that we, in a sense, call into being in line with our prejudices and biases. And the point, she says on page 262, is that both despair and triumph are inherent in the same event, namely the invention of the telescope. And that Galileo, what he proved, right, is that the worst fear and the most presumptuous hope of human speculation, the ancient fear that our senses, our very organ for the reception of reality, might betray us, and, so that's the despair, and the Archimedean wish for a point outside the earth from which to unhinge the world. The Archimedean idea that with a lever long enough, you could find a point way outside the earth in which you could hinge and unhinge the earth and move it, right? And what she's using the Archimedean point for here in its metaphorical sense, which she takes from Kafka in the epigraph to the whole chapter 6, is that the scientific view, the idea that the world can be understood through reason and mathematics, that we can understand the world in its abstractness as a universe following universal and cosmological rules, is based on a view of the earth and everything in it, including ourselves, that is from nowhere, is from a space, a spot, a point so far off the earth that we can, from that point, look down on everything, including us, and see ourselves simply as experimental data, as nodes in a system of data. I mean, so imagine, you know, a scientist in a lab with rats, and the rats run around. The rats just think they're living their lives, but the scientist is finding laws and predictions and probabilities of how they move. The scientific view that we don't live in the world as sensible beings, but we understand ourselves as law-abiding beings, means that we treat ourselves like rats increasingly. We dehumanize ourselves. We follow these universally valid laws and rules, and we handle nature from a point in the universe outside the earth, this Archimedean point. What this means is that we begin to see the world not as it is in a real objective sense, but through our own rational attempts to make sense of it. And that's what she calls modern relativism. We begin to enter into ourselves and only see not the world, but ourselves, or the world as we create it. And this is what she means by earth alienation. We are alienated from the very earth on which we live, and we increasingly see the world as minds, as brains, not as embodied beings. And she'll say on 264, compared with the earth alienation, this is what she's talking about, underlying the whole development of natural science in the modern age, the withdrawal from terrestrial proximity contained in the discovery of the globe as a whole, and the world alienation produced in the twofold process of expropriation and wealth accumulation are of minor significance. Even though at the time, expropriation and mapping seemed much more important than the discovery of the telescope, over the last 300 years, this discovery of the telescope, the earth alienation, the internalization of the world, the internalization of a mathematical worldview has been for her the most important underlying event of the modern, it inaugurates the modern age, because it is what teaches us above all to distrust the common world. It is what makes us skeptical of the shared, real, sensible world. And the key, besides the event of the telescope, the other real event that makes this new worldview, this change from a worldly to a internal, universal worldview, what makes it possible is the replacement of geometry with algebra as the science of sciences, right? So this is where I have to at least say something about my own work. So in my first book, The Gift of Science, one of the key chapters is about the move in the 17th century in Leibniz's work from geometry to algebra as the top science in moral and legal reasoning, right? This is what I trace in my book on The Gift of Science. I hadn't read or hadn't thought about it in the way Arendt was talking about, but what I was saying is what she was trying to say, or saying better than I could ever say it. But it's that that geometry is still connected to the world in that it's still shapely. It still has a connection to space. But the move in science in the 17th century from geometry to algebra fully abstracts us from the world. And it opens a new way to meet nature through the experiment under conditions of man's own mind, as she says on 265. What this means is that increasingly, only those things exist that we have reasons for. I'll say that again in a different way. The first formulation of Leibniz's formulation of the highest law of science is that nothing is without a reason, right? Nihil est sine ratione, the principle of sufficient reason. And what Leibniz understands about the principle of sufficient reason is that if nothing is without a reason, that means if you don't understand it, it doesn't exist. The world disappears from its reality unless we rationally understand it. That's what Leibniz understood science to accomplish. And Arendt here, not surprisingly, cites Leibniz on 267 as the thinker of this, and she's right. And so the overarching argument here is that what science does is de-realize the world, internalize the world into universals. And that is at the very core of all of Arendt's thinking about the rise of fictions and totalitarianism, the loss of reality, the loss of truth, the loss of a common world. So much of what Arendt is doing in all of her other work is here, given its kind of philosophical, historical foundations. All right, I've talked a little bit longer than I usually do. I apologize. I just think this is a really important section. And I hope you found it helpful, and look forward to questions. A reminder, questions can come in either through the chat where you can talk amongst yourselves, and that's great. And also you can raise your hand. The raise hand function is at the bottom of your Zoom screen under the reactions button. You raise your hand and I'll call on you in the order that you raise your hand. Please do keep your questions brief if you can. We have a lot of people on, and I look forward to it. The first question I have is from Hal.
Yeah, no, I almost feel bad.
Hold on, Hal, I'm not hearing you. Is it me or you?
No, you can hear me now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I almost feel bad asking this as the first question because you were discussing a lot of this more like really awe-inspiring themes of some of this later part of the chapter first. But basically, my question is about Arendt's discussion of universal man throughout this various chapter and kind of this like globalization of people. And in the previous chapter, she says that she doesn't believe in the idea of sovereignty as a goal or sovereignty as something that's important. So sure, she doesn't like the idea of universal human rights or universal man because there's this one thing which she brings up in this chapter, which is kind of this more epistemological thing, but she also says basically people can't be protected on a universal basis. Like in other words, you need to have, but in order to protect people, you need state sovereignty. So I don't understand where that comes in. I mean, in this chapter, she discusses kind of the importance of the nation state, and she makes that a claim. And of course, the defining characteristic of the nation state is sovereign. And I mean, I've seen some authors who have read Arendt try to get around this. They've said things like, there was a review of Origins by Samantha Power where she said, well, in today's world, Arendt wouldn't have possibly been able to know about the strength of things like international human rights law or international human rights norms, or the idea of that we now have some of these more global civil society organizations. So but of course she was writing in 2001, and since then, I mean, we've seen countless violations of human rights. So what is really going on here?
Yeah. Thanks, Hal. I mean, there's a fair bit going on and a couple different things. So on the one hand, the discussion of sovereignty and from the nation state from Origins is a little different from what's going on here, but they're related. So in the Origins, her discussion is about the nation state, right? And we need to distinguish the nation state versus the state. The nation state is for her a state in which one nation in the state is dominant. So, the typical example would be that in the Ukraine or in Poland, there are many non-Ukrainians and Poles. There are Jews, there are Roma, there are Russians, there are Germans. But in a nation state, the national majority, although it's not even always a majority, sometimes it's a national minority, has privileges and rights that make it make the other nations in the nation state second-class citizens. And so what Arendt worried is that the nation state was always going to be a state in which the national nation would the nation that was the state that owned the state power would be oppressing non-national minorities. And so she thought that we needed to that all attempts to limit the power of national majorities in nation states failed. That's what her reading of the early 20th century in Europe led to. And we needed to move beyond the nation state model. I think there's different ways one can imagine that. One would be to go back to states, which were not nation states. Now, controversially, she thought that there was a model for that, which was the United States. She, as a Jew who came to the United States as a stateless refugee, came to believe that the United States was a non-national state, and that it was one of the only non-national states in existence, and that the idea of it is that any person of any nationality could maintain their nationality but still be a full citizen of the state. Whether that's true or not is an important question, and it goes to really important debates that are going on right now. To my mind, the criticism of that argument is that the United States has, for most of its history, and maybe all of its history, been a white state. And insofar as it's white, anyone could become a full citizen as long as they assimilated to whiteness. So if that's the case, then she would be wrong, and it would be still a kind of nation state. Whether or not that's wrong or not is an interesting question, an important question. But that was one idea she had. The other idea she has, which she raises in many essays, never with any kind of rigor, is federal states. So first in Europe, then in her reading of America, and then in her writing on Israel and Palestine, she argues that the way to address this problem of the oppression of non-national minorities by national majorities is to create federal states in which each people within the state has its own government and authority, and yet the state is one state, but there's a kind of federated system. And there's a number of actually social democratic and Marxist writers at the time, Otto Bauer and others, who are writing about this idea in Europe, and she allies herself with them, trying to think these things through. I don't think she ever comes up with an answer. I don't think she ever thinks she came up with an answer. These are simply, she sees the problem with nation states. She just doesn't have a solution for it. The one solution which many people suggest, which she fully rejects, is one Hal mentioned, which is a kind of world government. She thinks that's a disaster. And she thinks that any government in which there's sovereignty, in which one group has power, is likely to become corrupted and become totalitarian at some point. And the only thing that protects us is the fact that we have multiple sovereigns and multiple governments and multiple states. And if one or two become totalitarian, the rest can fight them. And she thinks a world government would destine us to totalitarian domination.
What about a world, because that gets to the parts of this which I guess are more pertinent, a world identity, because she clearly says that a lot of these things are breaking down. And I think that one thing that has occurred with human rights is that it's not much as literally like you're going to have this single government. It's installing these certain norms, which in and of themselves, Arendt probably wouldn't argue protect humanity, but might form kind of the basis of an identity at this time, which, because it's one thing that's clear about this chapter, it's a chapter about identity crises.
Yeah, I mean, again, part of her, remember, for Arendt, plurality is at the core of what it means to be a political being. The idea that there would be a kind of universal or world identity is for her, in some sense, deeply scary. That's why, and so the first aspect of world alienation, this mapping that she talks about, what it really worries her is that as we become more and more cosmopolitan, we lose the close at hand and we see things from afar. And in that, we become alienated from what matters in the world, our day-to-day lives. That's what leads to loneliness. That loneliness is what leads people to grasp onto ideological mass movements. So the danger of sort of a world identity, we're all human beings, is sort of the way it's presented, is for Arendt a meaningful danger. It's a danger that there's nothing more lonely than human beings, right? We are all, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a Bardian, I'm a Jew, I'm whatever I am, I'm American. These identities stop me from being lonely by giving me parochial biases and prejudices. And for Arendt, as we've talked about, you can't be human without biases and prejudices. And if you seek to become sort of some abstract human who lives everywhere and nowhere, she thinks we lose our meaning, we lose our sense of who we are. And that's what leads to loneliness. And loneliness is the great danger of our time, because lonely people will seek meaning in totalitarian ideological movements.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Some other people should be able to go now.
Okay, thanks, Hal. Rob, you're up next.
Thanks again for the great talk, and apologies if you hear things outside. There's loud noises. I wanted to talk about a similar thing, I guess. Wage labor, I think you said, kind of in a way precludes worldliness. There's kind of a rootlessness that results from it. And I'll just read a quick quote. The new laboring class, which literally lived from hand to mouth, stood not only directly under the compelling urgency of life's necessity, but was at the same time alienated from all cares and worries, which did not immediately follow from the life process itself. And I want to contrast these concepts with an experience I had this morning. I woke up, I'm living in a new area, so I went to a barber shop, new barber shop, have never been there before. And upon walking into the barber shop, you could tell that there was a sense of world there, at least I perceived it. Everybody kind of knew each other. There are, 6 people in a slightly enclosed space. They had, gestures to greet each other in certain ways. They used their own language. Clearly, I was out of a space there, but for me to be out of space means that there was a space there to be had. So I want to question this idea that what Arendt is saying is that this wage labor precludes any kind of world, like because we are laborers, that we are alienated from the world. It seems that my experience this morning
I see what you're saying.
is against that kind of idea.
So, I mean, I think I clearly, if the argument is that anyone who earns a wage is dehumanized, I think you're right. It's an inaccurate argument. Let's just historicize a little bit the claim around where you're reading, right? So she makes a series of claims. They're not all at the same time. So she, on the first, says that this development of expropriation starts by expropriation and fed upon it would result in an enormous increase in human productivity. Okay, fine. The new laboring class, which literally lived from hand to mouth, stood not only directly under the compelling urgency of life's necessity, but was at the same time alienated from all cares and worries, which did not immediately follow from the life process itself. So she's talking about a particular historical moment in which people basically earned simply enough to eat and then had to earn more to eat again the next minute. And in that kind of life, the compelling urgency of life's necessities, all we have is life and there's no world, right? What was liberated in the early stages of the first free laboring class in history was this labor power. Now, she doesn't think that's what we have today. So if you look at the footnote down at the bottom of page 255, footnote 5, she'll say, this, of course, is markedly different from present conditions, where the day laborer, the original laborer who worked for one day so they could eat and then had to work another day if they could eat, has already become a weekly wage earner. No, not a day laborer, but a weekly wage earner. And in probably not a distant future, a guaranteed annual wage. Call that unemployment insurance, Social Security, or a guaranteed universal income. Thank you, Andrew Yang, right? The point is that we will create what she calls a class. We will move from being an alienated individual to man who's in society and is a member of a class. And as a member of a class or in society, they can have a world. And they can also be part of a nation. And obviously they can be part of a local town as well. I don't think that stands in any way against what she's saying. So what is she saying? She's saying that increasingly, though, where we find our membership and our identity are in things like society or a class or nations or eventually humanity. And Rob's pointing out and saying, well, no, people still find their identity in a barbershop. And I think you're right that some do, but what she's saying is most don't, right? I think the claim is that, yeah, there are some local lucky people who still have meaningful worlds, who are grounded in and situated in a world, but increasingly people are not. You may not. Now that's in some sense, it's an empirical claim, and you'll have to judge whether you think it's true or not. I mean, I think for a lot of people like myself who travel around the world and, we try and keep communities, and there is a community, and I hope I have a community and whatever, but, it's an increasingly placeless view. And how does one respond to that? I think some people better than others, and I think it's possible to keep a sense of place and identity and personhood. But I think what she's saying is that increasingly, those of us who live this way, whether from wage labor or because we're, living internationally and traveling a lot, lose this close at hand, lose this sense of daily friction and life with in a particular place with a small group of people. And that's part of the loss of the common world. I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Yeah. Catherine. Catherine, are you here? Yeah.
Sorry, trying to get to my unmute button. Okay, so especially as you're talking, like kind of towards the end about this sort of like means of this kind of like radical shift in how we see ourselves and those notions of interiority, I'm really intrigued by that. But I had a hard time with the beginning of these chapters, because the setup of them, and even the three specific examples that she gives, I just am at a point where I have a hard time believing her that these are the three things, because it is so, and I don't want, I'm not just trying to like slam on her. I do think we need to hold her like accountable for our own reading of these things, but it is so Eurocentric, to say that the discovery of the world is when Europeans mapped it, because the world wasn't discovered and indigenous peoples had mapped their worlds, so it's just how I don't want to lose her insights. And I mean, even things about like telescopes and the sort of measuring of, like, I feel like there are lots of cultures that understood, maybe not with the precision we have with like modern technology, but understood the cosmos, understood the expansiveness of the world. I have a hard time believing her that these three things changed the world. I think that they changed, kind of like Western intellectual people, which we all, participate in, and that has an effect on the rest of the world with industrialization, all of that. but I have a hard time like buying the argument because I'm so suspicious at this point in my life of the setup that these three things are like the linchpins of civilization, because I kind of feel like we've gotten that wrong. Like we've thought that for a while, and that's hubris. So I just want help with that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Thanks, Catherine. You know, I think all I can say, what I'm going to do is say there's two parts the way I see your question, right? One part is the sort of factual part, right? To what extent is it true that it's in the 16th and 17th centuries that we begin mapping the world and losing connection to our space? And to what extent is it true that in the 17th century and 18th century with the Protestant Reformation, you know, wage labor and capitalism emerge? And to what extent is it true that with the rise of the telescope and modern science, a universal view of the world emerges? You know, all of these things are prefigured both in Europe and in China and Africa and other places as well, and in Central America and the Mayans and Incas. You can find prefigures of all these things, and so, you know, one is, why does she focus on these three particular, you know, Western events? And I think one could and should raise the question of, you know, can we enrich her view of it and understanding of it by bringing in other views and other cultures and other ways? And is she, in a sense, wrong to limit it or focus on these three? And are there others that are more important, right? So that's one way I think your question, and I take that to be an important part of contemporary Arendt scholarship, and if not a corrective, at least a broadening and a widening and an improving of the Arendtian project. The second way I understand your question is, does the fact that she's telling a story through a particular European lens, which she is, weaken or strengthen, or neither, the story? You know, she's telling a particular story about a European tradition. So on one level, it would be hubris for her to tell a different story and try and tell a story about Africa. She doesn't know anything about Africa or China. But that second question, the second part of that is it true that, as she thinks, and I think she thinks this, that the European story is becoming the global story, the world story, right? I mean, has capitalism become a world idea? Has science, Western European science as it developed, become a world, you know, around the world? And I think there's, you know, there's ways in which I think the answer is yes, and there's ways in which I think the answer is no. And one, you know, and I think that there are real, I mean, one of the most interesting world conflicts that we're going to see right now is between, you know, the US and China, or between the West and China, to some degree. You know, and can there be other different ways of really organizing life outside of capitalism and other things? I don't know. But you know, I think her argument would be that whether it's ethnocentric or Eurocentric or not, largely in the late 20th and early 21st century, or when she's writing this in the mid 20th century, the Western view has largely become a dominant worldview. You may disagree with that, and I think it's worth asking. And I think she would welcome the fact that it's not. I think she, in a sense, fears that it has. So those are the two ways I think that your question is important and can be asked. Is that, do you want to?
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. And the one other thing, and you don't have to go out, like, I found her comment on secularism, her sort of redefinition of secularism, fascinating, especially as like a person. Secularism has always been defined to me as the rise of the non-religious, and like in my work and in the communities that I've been in, I'm around a lot of religious people who have a secular mindset but remain very religious. So I really appreciated that redefinition of not tying it to religiosity, which I have always thought is just kind of like a historical mistake. People are differently religious, but not necessarily less. So
that's right.
Yeah, it's a great insight from her. So
yeah, I've always
thanks.
found that line, that it's just a page, but it's a great page, and it'll come up again later in this chapter. So keep your eye out for it. Cool. Bob, you're up next.
Hi, in our extracurricular small group, we've been chasing after this concept of amor mundi. And at various times, we see kind of different explanations of it. And I'm working toward a couple of questions here. But based on her concept of alienation, or scientifically originated alienation, now I'm seeing amor mundi as kind of her answer to this alienation. So she's going to plant her flag in the world and challenge alienation on that basis. But my two questions are for her, and kind of the idea of plurality and political action and immortality aside for the moment. For her, is amor mundi the best we can do in the face of this alienation? And for us, is it all we can do in the face of this alienation?
Thank you, Bob. So first, just a plug. I mean, I think there's about 10 of these small groups that people have joined that are meeting or more. And it's really great that these conversations are continuing and that you end up with such great questions. So if you're not in one of these groups and you'd like to be, go to our website, the reading group website, and feel free to join one. Is amor mundi the best we can do? I don't know if it's the best we can do, but it's the beginning. Arendt, amor mundi emerged for Arendt. She writes a poem about it as she's walking in Riverside Park. And, it emerged for her as she became aware of the extent of the Holocaust, right? She had left Germany in 1933. There was no Holocaust in 1933. And she says in a number of places, when she first started hearing stories of the camps, she didn't believe it. She just couldn't believe that that would happen. And when she finally reads the reports and realizes what had happened in those camps, she takes a walk in Riverside Park and writes a poem about what it means to love the world, amor mundi. And so on one level, it's simply planting a flag, as you rightly put it. It's saying, I am not going to give up on this world. I am going to find things to love in it. I don't think it's all one can do, or the best one can do. If you insist on loving the world, that means that you take care for it and you have a responsibility for it. And part of what that means is you live in the world and you engage in the world. And that means acting, having the courage to be out in the world. It means talking to people who disagree with you, and instead of yelling and retreating to your own private worlds, so you each are happy with what you believe, forcing yourself to find something in common. That's why, you know, that line that I've talked about a lot in this group, which I find so important in Arendt's work, talking about justice and piety can make the world more just and more pious. Why? Because in talking about it, we enter the world and we give the world a kind of comment. If I talk about it with you, Bob, we start to talk and there's a common world that emerges. And that's a world we can love. And so for her, you said politics and plurality. Yeah, I think Amor Mundi is the beginning, but it's only the beginning. You have to have the courage to go out into a world that's often quite foreign and awful, and talk with people and act with people and try and make that world a world you can love. So yeah, I think it's a great question. And these chapters are about the deep underlying you know, trends or ideas and events that tear us away from the world. You know, we want to make money. We want to live. We don't want to be in the world. We want to make some money and consume. We want to travel all over the place and see the world and run away from home, not make the home that we want to live in. And we want to improve the world and understand the world through science, not live in a world that takes what's given to us as meaningful and important. So these are the very root of how Arendt thinks it means to love the world. I think that's an absolutely right way to understand it. Is that all right, Bob? Do you want to add in anything?
No,
Roger,
thank you. That's very good. But you know, I found such a deep pessimism in the explanation about the scientific alienation, which is only going to become greater and greater.
Yeah.
And so the way you put it, yeah, that's what we can do. That's what we ought to do. But still, it seems like it's something Sisyphusian. You know, we're going to keep pushing that way, and that gives us meaning. But at the other end, you know, somehow this scientific alienation eventually will overwhelm us.
I think that's fair. I mean, you know, I don't like to think of Arendt as a pessimistic writer. I think she's someone who tries to face reality. But in facing reality, you know, her hope is that new thoughts and new acts and new events will emerge that will change things. You know, this book, to come back to the opening lines, is an attempt to think what we are doing, with the hope that in thinking about it and talking about it, we will have some agency in how it develops. I think you're right that she has a fairly pessimistic understanding of certain trends, but I don't think she sees those trends as faded. I mean, this is where, you know, I think she doesn't see this as fate. I think she sees this as human decisions that we have to make, and that's what politics is about. Bill, did you want to jump in? I heard.
To your exhortation about to stand up and participate, I think that's one thing you have to add to that. It's beautifully said it, and do it nonviolently. Because, and that is a caveat that a lot of us are not down with. Because, yeah, so I want to be in the world, I want to make the world that I want to be in, but if the world is populated by powerful sons of bitches who do not see me as human, how do I get their attention? Enough said.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You know, I mean, so there's, you know, Arendt thinks that politics has to be done to some degree non-violently. It's about persuasion. She does in the essay on violence, right? She does say there are times when an act of violence can be justified, but rare. And it's so rare that most of the time it will actually be counterproductive, not productive.
Do you know if Hannah Arendt ever went to the Congo, ever went to a colony, really saw what it's like? She's saying, you know, engage your masters, engage your slavers, engage your overlords, and reason with them. It sounds, you know, I feel like, as Catherine was saying earlier, sometimes I don't believe her because I don't know if she has the kind of experience. I know she was a Jewish woman that dealt with the Holocaust, but she was a kind of elite. Her education made her elite.
Well, she as you know, Bill, she was in the Gors detention camp, which you've done an entire show on.
And she was the last train out of Gors. My mother-in-law, Dora Amelon, was working at Gors, right? Yeah. So yes, yeah, we always say that, but is it the same thing as really being a person living in the Jim Crow South? Now I know we start comparing our atrocities and all, and here's the Black person on the phone is once again that old saw about this. I heard it in Catherine, something Catherine was saying about not believing her. Now I'm trying to understand maybe why she has a blind spot. So there's a limitation. Is that Bob who just made that about Amor Mundi? I think that Bob is a limitation. I mean, I don't know if you're really willing to sit down with people who want you dead.
Yeah.
And well, that's all I
think you're right. And that's why I think it's important that, and that's why when you said without nonviolent, my first response was not always. You know, Arendt spent the early 1940s writing article after article calling for the rising of a Jewish army, saying that Jews need to fight. She writes in On Violence that there are times in which injustice is so extreme that the only way people suffering injustice can make the injustice visible is through violence. And in that case, she says violence can be justified. So, you know, I hear what you're saying. And I think, you know, clearly, no, I don't think she ever went to the Congo. I don't think she ever, but I think she understood that there are times when violence is what's called for. She doesn't think it's the way politics should generally be done, not when politics is working, but there are times when politics isn't working. And you need to do something. But what she says is you better do it well, because if you do it in a way that seems unviolent, you know, seems to, you know, to be violent and not in the name of justice, it will lead to more oppression and more repression. And it will lead to more violence, and it won't actually make the world more just. So it's a dangerous move to engage in violence, but there are times when it's necessary.
I just saw someone, and I wanted whoever just said that violence once you start is hard to stop. I can't. Please excuse me if I'm being patronizing. Some of us are born in a world where to be who we are is a target of violence. To walk down the street and look like you do, you are a target of violence. So what do I say to this person? I don't know, it was in the chat, you know, once violence starts, well, this whole fucking country started with violence.
Yeah. And
so
by the way,
I'm getting wound up, and I don't want to give that energy right now, but thank you for taking my question.
Yeah, no, that's a quote from Hannah Arendt, that violence, once it starts, is hard to stop.
I want to jump in for 1 second.
Yeah.
Because I think there's another element here for me when I read about what she's talking about talking. She talks about goodwill. And I think you have to decide when you're engaging with someone, especially you disagree with, does that person have goodwill? And if the person doesn't have goodwill, there is no point in engaging with them. So I think she actually qualifies this in other places. She doesn't make a big deal of it, but to me, it's pivotal. Don't spend your time arguing with someone who has no goodwill.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan. I'm gonna move on the list. We can hopefully we'll come back to these if it comes up again. But John. John, are you here?
I'm here. I'm just unmuting.
Okay.
It feels to me that it keeps feeling to me. When I look through the world through Arendt's lenses, that I'm standing on a beach watching a tsunami about to approach, and because all I see as she goes through her parade is that technology or these changes keeps driving us to use your own word, to be dehumanized as a species. And the dehumanization process only, regardless of all these attempts to try and reverse it through politics, through negotiation, through occasional violence, we as a species seem to be on an eventual parade to our ultimate destruction of the species. I don't hear anything else beside that. And or at least for me, I don't, but that's what we keep coming back to, these brief moments to love the world, these brief moments to negotiate and politics. But the march of the man, of man, has been to constantly dehumanize us. And it's almost like there's the finality of it. And she doesn't, that's what I see. That's what I see in the world through her lens. Maybe you can point it in a different direction.
You know, I hear that. And I think there's a way in which reading Arendt can be really depressing. And yet she doesn't think of it depressing. And I think you have to take that to heart. She's thinking about these questions. She's talking about them. She's writing about them. She's acting in doing so. And in thinking, talking, writing, and acting, she's being human. And she's keeping alive the human world. And in ways that she has no idea what will come of her actions, right? Because we can never tell what's going to come of our actions. I guess what I'd say is, what Arendt, the optimism, I hate using simple words, but okay, the optimism of Arendt, the hope, is that this is what it means to be human, to engage in what we're doing, having these conversations, and then from that, to go out and put them into the world in our own ways. And some of those actions will fizzle and never be seen again. And maybe one or two of them will last, fizzle, grow, and maybe fizzle. And then some maybe grow. Things will happen. And that's what it means to be human for Arendt. We can't change the world, and we're not, she's not a social justice advocate in the sense that she thinks, I know it's right and we're going to make it right. She doesn't have those kind of answers. A lot of people do, right? She doesn't think those kind of answers work because she doesn't think we have the human capacity to, here's what we need to do. Here's how we do it. Now we're going to get it done. She sees humanity as living a life, building actions, building a world, creating things that last. And to the extent we're doing that, John, we're still doing it, and we're living a human life. Are there bad things in the world? You bet. Were there bad things in the world 50 years ago? You bet. Were there bad things in the world 500 years ago? You bet. Will there be bad things 1,000 years in the future? You bet. She's not a utopian. She doesn't believe there was ever a utopian era. She doesn't ever believe there was a good era. She believes there are human errors. And what keeps the thing human is we keep thinking and acting. Her worry is that it is becoming increasingly difficult to think and act in ways that matter in our world. That's her worry. And she's trying to respond to that in the only way she knows how, which is to think and act.
No, I don't have a disagreement with what you're saying. I'm just saying that the unfortunately the logical conclusion for me, and at the core, I don't think I'm a pessimist, is that her path is the path of her observations, which I see as accurate, is somewhat cataclysmic for the species.
Yeah. I would resist. I don't think that's her view. I think her view is that there are trends that are cataclysmic, but as long as there are humans and freedom, the cataclysm is only one possibility, but certainly not a fait accompli.
No, I don't say that's her view. I don't know her view.
Yeah.
I know that what her path is one of attempts of trying to find the positive and how to hear and try to move forward. But for me, unfortunately, I come from a very privileged position. I never had to tell my 3 children or 6 grandchildren, this is the procedure you have to do, and this is what you're going to be terrorized simply because of the accident of their birth. They weren't born Black or somewhat else or Asian. And but I see the march of man is an inclination towards violence, and it just doesn't seem that we can get off that path. Anyway. Thank you.
I hope we can. I'm just going to mute everybody so we get rid of some of these sounds. And I'll ask you to unmute when you are speaking. Jyoti? I'm sorry if I get that wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Jyoti?
I don't. Yeah, Jyoti. Yeah.
Jyoti.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks Roger for VRGs. My question is, so I'm trying to read the work of French philosopher Bernard Stiegler vis-a-vis what Hannah Arendt is saying, and I find a lot of parallels. So when he's talking about techne, which he's drawing from Heidegger, now again we can see parallel with Arendt because of Heidegger, and one can very interestingly think that there is an epistemological thing that he poses of knowing the world in relationship with the world and knowing the world without being in relationship with the world. When we talk of without being in relationship with the world, and both have their ontological ramifications also. When we talk of this without being in relationship, technique gets activated, and telescope and Hannah Arendt in this work and other work, one can see again the parallels of what she's trying to say. Now, where I want your comment and your observation is this idea of pharmacon, which Bernard is drawing from Derrida's Plato's Pharmacy, where he's talking of pharmacon as something which is not just curative and toxic, but from the toxicity, the healing can also come. When Arendt is talking about this triumph and despair, and not just in this human condition, but in other work also, it's spilled all over. Like, how do we love for the world, the care for the world, the Sorge that again Heidegger talks about in his work, which Bernard again draws. So I want your comment on this idea of pharmacon. Can we trace it in Arendt work and her other writings as well?
Thanks, Jyoti. So I don't know Stiglitz's work so well, and I haven't read about pharmacon in a long time. It's been a while, but the basic idea, as you said, is that certain drugs or poisons are also can heal. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot in Arendt that could fit in there. You know, although, you know, one of the interesting questions is to the extent that science is a poison, right? So I mentioned and I don't mean to be a jerk about it, but my book, The Gift of Science, gift means poison in German. The whole premise of my book was that science is a poison, and yet it's gives itself as a gift that offers benefits, but actually is destructive of our idea of justice. I think Arendt reads science partly in that way, but more as I think really in this double sense of both triumph and despair. And she leaves it as doing both. And I think she believes in both. I think she believes that science has an enormous benefit, not only in material ways, but in contributing to our human stature and our belief that we are immortal and that we are meaningful and you know, worthy of living. But I think she also sees it as deeply toxic and destructive of the worlds that we are creating. So, you know, if it's helpful for you to read it through the Pharmacon, I think that's totally fine. It's just not a language that I know well and use. I'm not sure what it adds to it, I guess would be my only point. I mean, do you think it adds something, Jyoti?
Yeah, I do think so, because Pharmacon is also that something which we need to explore, considering the urgency of our times. If we have to really, because the Anthropocene and the world in which we are entering in, the question of technology becomes very important, which again in Arendt work keeps coming again and again. So interesting thing is at how from toxicity the healing can come. How do we explore something like that? You know, so something that you just said about gift as well as about science, that it's not just, after all, a lot of things are possible through that also. So what are those knowledges? What are those kinds of education? What would be those attitudes through which all that is possible as well?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Heidegger will explore that in the idea of the saving at the end of Die Kehre, or the origin, or the question of technique. And, you know, for Arendt, if you want to have a analogous of what's the saving, it's talking, it's engaging and acting and speaking in the world. But I don't think that comes from science per se. Okay. Vivian.
Hi. So this may be very literal, but actually I do want to try and say what I want to say in a simple a way as possible. Perhaps you know, I really don't know anything about that whole area of the Pharmacon and all of that. I know nothing about that, but anyone who's sustained chemotherapy, for example, will be deeply familiar with the healing powers of toxins. I don't know whether that's an absurd thing for me to say, but outside of that, from the sublime to the ridiculous, I think that anyone who is struggling to see the humanity of the giant that is Hannah Arendt, I think should be referred to Ken Crimstein's book, Roger, The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt, which is so wonderful. And also he gives several good bits of advice. And one good bit of advice that he gives, Ken Crimstein that is to say that it's good when you're trying to read Arendt, when you do read Arendt, it's difficult. And so he recommends dipping into texts about Arendt rather than by Arendt as well, to sort of help the medicine go down, perhaps. He doesn't say that, I'm saying that. And then finally, what I wanted to say is I wanted to say thank you for today's session, because when you introduced it, you said how these two chapters or sections are so incredibly important in all of her writing achievement and her thinking achievement. And so obviously you feel very strongly about this. And I think that that the way you introduced it and the discussion that even we've had up to this point about it has embraced the pain and the tragedy of her life, of our lives, of human beings, of people in the world. And so I wanted to say thank you to that. And I also wanted to say how much I was thinking of an essay by Maurice Merleau-Ponty called Cézanne's Doubt, because when Arendt speaks about losing our Roger, what is the technical term? Even replacing geometry with algebra is enough. That abstraction. When writing about a painter who's often seen as one of the founders of a sort of postmodern way of perceiving, and all of this that we think on, that we ruminate on, that we look at, or that we might even see in Cézanne when we look at his paintings and read them and how he made them, was based on that phenomenological, that haptic, that physical doubt that he had, that he could not trust his senses and his perception. And that essay by Merleau-Ponty is one of the most beautiful essays on that anyone could ever read on any artist by anybody, and it's very much linked for me with. Well, first of all, I read it first in German, which is ridiculous since it was written in French. But I think, and I haven't read it in decades, but I think that the opening sentence is that the painter brings his body with him, and Arendt brings her body with her in this view of the world, and everything that she thinks and everything that she says and everything that she fights to understand. And this whole year of being exposed to her like this has totally changed my life, I would say. So thank you.
Vivian, thank you so much. I'm really glad to hear you're enjoying it and that this was a good day. It's an important day for me. I've been telling you all this whole last few weeks that that chapter 6 is going to be the key, and I hope is living up to it. I only want to say one thing about, I love Ken's book and I encourage people to read it, but I want to say one thing about the one thing you drew from it, which is read other sources on our end. Great. But I'm someone who, maybe to a fault, somewhat avoids secondary sources. We have to remember that some people get it right, some people get it wrong, different, whatever. But more than that, people get caught up in their own discourses and theories.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with you.
One of the things I love about Hannah Arendt is that she really is eigenartig. She's unique. And, while she's hard, and I admit it, to the extent possible, I always encourage people to read Hannah Arendt.
No, you're absolutely right.
Consult secondary sources, maybe check out the virtual reading groups. But
Yeah.
one of the reasons I do this is so I'm trying to enable people to read Hannah Arendt.
Yes.
And
It's
that's
true.
go
No,
ahead.
it's absolutely true. We can never underestimate her rigor. It's unparalleled. So thank you.
Thank you. Rosemary, welcome.
Okay, sorry, I'm muting myself. Well, having had that, I wanted to say something. I am not a scientist. I happen to have a partner who's a scientist, but I read section 36 with great alarm, not about Arendt's underlying theories, but by how wrong I felt she was on many of her descriptions. And I noticed that she takes a lot of, talking of secondary sources, she takes a lot of her footnotes are sourced with Bertrand Russell, with Whitehead, with secondary sources themselves. But I just feel she gets a lot of the actual physics wrong. And I wanted to sort of put in a plug for the physicists who do love the world and who use their science to describe it, and whose science is not considered complete unless it is validated in the real world. And you can take Einstein's theory of general relativity, for example. He was extremely anxious that this eclipse of the sun take place. It was that he could measure whether his theory worked out. And the First World War interrupted it at the beginning, and at the end, German and English scientists who were at war with whose countries were at war with one another, devised a plan where they would go and measure an eclipse that was going to occur in 1919, and actually did it and proved it, and proved that Einstein was right. And that was terrifically important to him. The other person she mentions is Heisenberg, and she says, where is it? On the bottom of page, she talks about, I think it's here, how Heisenberg's point is that the observed object has no existence independent of the observing subject. And that's wrong. His principle was that you could neither you couldn't judge two things at the same time. You could either judge their position or their velocity, but they had an independent existence whether you were measuring them or not. And therefore, you are still describing the world. You're not in this. She seems to take the uncertainty and the relativity as things that are relative to one another, whereas the scientists that had an actual very concrete application of these to the world. I mean, I think there are theories. I think string theory has never been proved, and so that is a purely mathematical construct. But mathematics itself is not itself self-contained.
Mommy's not here, and call her on her cell, okay?
It's based on certain axioms which can't be proved outside itself. So my real point is that although I relate to what she's saying about science, especially when it concerns algorithms, especially that, how computer intelligence is going. With physics, however, I think it's very grounded in trying to describe the world. And for me, it adds to the world. I don't feel more alienated because we know that the laws of gravity apply to the cosmos. I feel happier that we are discovering these laws that have greater application, and we are describing our world in that way. So I just wanted to say that, a plea for the scientists who love the world too.
Thank you. We always should have a plea for the scientists. I think Rosemary brings up an important point. I should add that the scientists largely agree with Arendt, at least people like Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and Einstein. Arendt is in no way saying that they are not, responsible physicists who are trying to understand the world. That's not at all what she's, I think, saying. But if you read Heisenberg, you know, he's making the same point in a number of his essays and books. You know, she quotes him at the bottom of page 261. Wenn man versucht, von der Situation in der modernen Natur, when one seeks in the situation of modern natural sciences, to go out from the fundamental positions. So one has the impression that for the first time in the course of the history of man on this earth, we only stand against ourselves, that we in a certain way are only encountering ourselves. Heidegger writes, I mean, Heisenberg writes a whole book on this, about the mirror and the Naturbild of modern physics. He is, you know, now that is in no way, and he's not saying what I'm doing is not serious confronting the world. What he's saying is that when we confront the world, we confront the fact that in the end, we are confronting a world that we are encountering through our ways of experimenting and studying it. And that we are confronting a world in which we are saying that the world follows these cosmological laws. Now, it's true that the world does, when we run experiments on it, follow these universal and cosmological laws. So it's not like we're lying. As you know, we're good scientists. We're handling it this way. But that way of seeing the world is a scientific way of seeing the world. It's certainly not the only way of seeing the world. And there's no claim in science that it's the most valid way, right? I mean, science could never make that claim because science is based on hypotheses. There may be other ones. So you know, I don't think Arendt is critical of science at all, and I don't think she's diminishing scientists and their, you know, integrity. I think on the opposite, she's taking seriously what these scientists are doing and taking seriously what they say are the consequences of what they're doing. Now, not everyone has to agree with Heisenberg, and not everyone has to agree with Schrödinger. But I think she and they are on to something important. I mean, I'm not a physicist, and you know, I've talked to physicists about this. I mean, some of you know, I spent the first 8 years of my professional career writing about Leibniz, right, who is a scientist. And I think one of the reasons I have been attracted to Arendt and to this part of Arendt is because I think what she says is so clearly connects with what I understood Leibniz to be saying and doing. The very premise of Leibniz's work is that nothing is without a reason, that things are not without a reason. That's a metaphysical claim. And he takes it with utmost seriousness. And he's not a bad scientist. He's a good scientist. But you know, without knowing why something is, he thinks it doesn't exist. That's in his mind a scientific claim, because the very premise of science is that everything has to have a reason. Science is a kind of ontology. It's a kind of metaphysics. And all great scientists, I think, know that. Leibniz, Heisenberg, Einstein, etc. And Arendt is in a sense taking seriously that metaphysical ontology of science. I don't think that's in any way a knock on the scientists. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but that's just, I see it as as taking them with utmost care and seriousness.
Well, yeah, no, and there are arguments about language that also can be related to that in terms of how it describes the world. And quantum mechanics, of course, also challenges this idea that science is for a reason, because it creates a problem. But my other point was that it doesn't alienate me, and in so much as and this may be my Eurocentric Western viewpoint, but I find some of it very illuminating and magical, and a lot in the fact that the math works in this way, it is pretty mind-blowing at times.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's a great point, right? Some people find it very easy to live in this scientific world. You know, interestingly enough, usually by taking a lot on faith, because very few of us can, I'll speak for myself, I certainly can't understand most of the physics behind most of what these people say. So it seems very nice and beautiful, but that's because I take it on faith that they're right. You know, what do I know? And, you know, the truth is most physicists can't understand what other physicists have done in other fields. I mean, it's just, you know, that's why these things are so hyper specialized. And so to some extent, we sort of have to take it on some sort of faith. But for, you know, as long as it's just people throwing numbers up on a page, we can say, oh, that's nice. But, you know, when it matters, it gets more complicated. I mean, what do we tell people when we, you know, when we tell them not only does the sun not revolve around the earth, right? But the earth doesn't revolve around the sun. In fact, they both, depending on where your perspective is, one could revolve around the other, or the other could revolve around one, which is where science ended up. Well, for a lot of us, that's a really interesting and beautiful point. And I might, you know, smoking something I shouldn't be smoking, sit at night and think that's really cool. But, you know, in my daily life, I want to know if the sun revolves around the earth or the earth revolves around the sun. And
what is the science for that? The non-heliocentric universe. Where is that?
I'd have to go back and look at it. I mean, it comes from an attempt to think outside of an earthly universe. I forget who she's citing on that particular point. I mean, I've looked it up in the past, but I don't remember presently. But the point is that, you know, the fact that electrons exist, but we don't know where they are. I mean, it's a great idea. It's nice, but in the end, I want to know where things are. And so to the, you know, as long as it's just unimportant, it can be nice and not alienating. But when it actually challenges our daily understanding of the world, I think it can be quite alienating. And I think a lot of people are alienated, maybe less so by physics because they just don't understand it, but social science, right? You know, when social science tells us, well, actually, you know, no one really acts, they just, you know, follow trends and norms. You know, people say, what the hell? I act, you know, I'm free, I act, you know, there's an anger that emerges against these kind of you know, totally abstract social science arguments. And I think that's a lot of the anger that we're seeing in the world today. And that's not to say that the social science arguments are wrong, just like it's not to say that the physical arguments are wrong, but it does disorient people from their common sense, and that's difficult, and sometimes for good reasons, right? I mean, when social science shows us discrimination, when people thought it was just normal, okay, there's a good reason to show discrimination, but it's upsetting people's daily understanding of the world. Maybe for good, but it is alienating. Unless you're one of these people who can somehow internalize the sort of social science world and make it your own. But that's a very small group of people, I think. And she certainly thinks so.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Hannah, you'll get the last question.
Thank you, Roger. So I'm kind of not clear on the Reformation as one of the key events. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, particularly because she is the author of The Origin of Totalitarianism. And I'm just curious about the institution of the church, as both Catholicism and Protestantism represent institutions focused on, you know, establishing a Christian nation and these types of ecclesiastical law that was very problematic. And also, it seems like she loves, you know, she studied St. Augustine and the concept of love and caritas and neighborly love, but he also propagated the notion of original sin, and there were other ideas that were very problematic in that. And so I'm just curious if she's identifying the institution and the ways in which it contributes to our lack of freedom or lack of will, and why the Reformation.
So yeah, thank you, Hannah. I mean, the two reasons she gives are sort of the Protestant ethic, but more importantly, the expropriation of the land from the peasants. I'm not a historian. My understanding, and I'm hoping someone here can tell me where I'm off, is that with the Reformation, there is a demand that the church clean up its act. You know, it had been buying and selling, what's it called? Indulgences and other things. And as part of it, they were expropriated from land, and power was given to the secular governments, and the church was sort of kicked off its, you know, having all the land. It now became land of the monarch, not land of the church. If I'm wrong about that, someone tell me, because that's my understanding, but I may be making it up. But her argument is that when that happened, the peasants, who had been, in a sense, tied to the land in a way that they weren't free, but they were also free because they actually tied to the land, had land, suddenly were kicked off the land or had to pay for the land. And when they couldn't, they became day laborers. And that this was, along with the Protestant ethic, was the beginning of capitalism and wealth accumulation. And that in doing so, it alienated them from a place in the world and made them these sort of abstract wage laborers. That's, I think, the main argument here about the Reformation. I don't think it's a theological or doctrinal argument.
Say, Roger.
Yeah.
I'm 50 years out of practice as a historian, but as I recall, the situation of the peasants or the land workers was really quite varied. When you go from Britain, where there were enclosures, to Germany, especially East Germany, where there were larger farms, and part of the dislocation I think was due to the fact that not as many workers were needed. So it might behoove us all to find some kind of a historian who really understands the picture from, Ireland, Britain, Germany, through Eastern Europe to Russia. I think it's far more complicated than what Hannah Arendt is suggesting.
I would love to find that historian. If anyone has a good idea of who to read or talk to, I'd appreciate it. I mean, from a legal point of view, and my background's in law, it is around this time that the monarchy takes over, and all land in England at least becomes part of the monarch, not the church. I think I think she's basically making a legal argument that the land is no longer owned by the church, and that the people, the peasants, now have to work to stay on it rather than than have a tie to it. But I would love to learn more about this period if people tell me who to read. I know you guys all have. Karl Polanyi wrote The Great Transformation. Yeah, I just read that last year, and I don't remember it. I'll have to go back and look at that. Thank you, Joyce. I have it on my desk in my house up at Red Hook. I'll look at that again. All right. Thank you all. This was great. I'm really excited to read the next few chapters or sections with you of chapter 6. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next Friday. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias, Professor Roger.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.